President Cyril Ramaphosa says passing a time-bound, targeted, trade-related aspects of intellectual property rights waiver for COVID-19 vaccines is vital for saving millions of lives globally. The Economist Intelligence Unit estimates that vaccine inequality will come at a cost of some $2.3 trillion to global GDP between 2022 and 2025. Well, for more on the TRIPS waiver, we're joined by London School of Economics and Political Science Intellectual Property Law Associate, Professor Siva Tambiseti. Good evening to you, and thank you so much for your time tonight. Firstly, you've been reflecting alongside some of your colleagues quite a lot about the TRIPS waiver that was put forward by India and South Africa, and looking at some of the challenges or even the disjunctures between currently what the World Trade Organizations allows in terms of the sharing of intellectual property versus what is being proposed by the TRIPS waiver. Let's talk about some of the issues that you find arise.
Thank you, Kathy. We've just passed a rather sad anniversary. It was exactly a year ago yesterday that South Africa and India put in the proposal for the TRIPS waiver at the WTO. Since then, we've had sadly very little progress on the sharing of technology and know-how globally. Now, why is this a problem? It's a problem because vaccine inequity or inequality in how the doses are being distributed, we see is a direct function of where these doses are being produced. So if doses aren't being produced in low and middle income countries, we find that these doses are simply not getting into the arms of people in low and middle income countries. So of only 4% of the mRNA vaccines globally distributed have made their way into low income country arms. So in order to boost production and distribute how vaccines are produced, what we would like to see, myself along with colleagues, we wrote a paper making the legal and political case for the TRIPS waiver at the WTO. What we would like to see is for countries that have signed up to the WTO and the TRIPS agreement to be allowed to suspend intellectual property rights protections for the duration of the pandemic, not just for vaccines, but for prevention, treatments, and other medical technologies. We recently saw there's some good news coming out. There's a new antiviral that's being discovered by Merck, but at a price tag of $700 for 5 pills, it's unlikely to make its way into low and middle income countries. Now, so the TRIPS waiver at the WTO is not only about vaccines, but it's about all sorts of health needs that we are going to face during the pandemic and in the years post-pandemic, when health systems globally have to adjust and cope with the demands that have been made in these years.
And that's an important point that you are highlighting. The fact that even if the current waiver were to be given the green light fully, it still wouldn't respond entirely to the COVID-19 pandemic. And yet, when we look at the countries that have said that they support this waiver in its current form, there have been difficulties in actually getting follow-through where those commitments are concerned. Why is that? And what does that have to do with the bigger interests that are also probably lobbying a lot of these governments behind the scenes? And here I'm really referencing Big Pharma as well.
Yes, so Kathy, that's a really good point. So we've seen a lot of pledges for doses being made, even in the Global Vaccine Summit that was hosted by Biden. We saw commitments that were made, and a day or two later, we were being told that even those commitments were going to fall by at least 25% below what was expected. Now, I think pharmaceutical companies have been behaving quite irresponsibly on a number of different levels. They've been claiming, for instance, that there's going to be a glut of vaccines next year. I think this is simply not true. We're likely to need periodic booster doses for mRNA vaccines, perhaps even 2 doses of the Johnson & Johnson vaccine. And therefore, this is a constant need. In order to meet the needs that are acute and dire at the moment, we need to ramp up production by billions of doses. And that is simply not coming from the facilities that are available to the intellectual property holders. So what we would like to see is for Western governments to work alongside those who hold these intellectual property rights to engage at scale and with urgency in technology transfer so that we can create regional hubs in poorer parts of the world and can start ramping up production. Now, the fact that this hasn't happened is deeply troubling. It also shows, so for instance, these companies have been threatening that if they're asked to expand global production in this way, that they will not be able to meet domestic supply. And this has tied the hands of many countries. Now, beyond this, there is also a view taken of intellectual property rights that these rights are somehow inviolable. Now, I think this is even more problematic, not just for the pandemic, but also to prevent the next crisis that's coming. Even for rights such as the right to life, there is some ambiguity. For example, when you look at euthanasia, we can test the moral weight of these rights. For intellectual property rights to be held out as some sort of rights that are absolutely sacrosanct, I think is a big problem, and a problem that wealthy countries have shown themselves incapable of facing up to. And I think this is where the moral and legal pressure at the WTO, made relentlessly, can perhaps start to shift positions. But we've seen very little real progress.
Let's talk about the argument that is made, particularly in some countries, and Europe being one of the areas that has faced this problem. That at the time of actually giving some support, we know initially there was a bit of reluctance, and then they did turn the corner with the U.S. and supported the TRIPS waiver, and there's been some backtracking since, and that has really been. They've used the fact that they didn't fully understand what they were supporting as a reason for this backtracking. And, other countries are also using it as an opportunity to follow suit, that they weren't actually wanting to give as much as it looks like they could well be giving.
So, yes, this is an interesting dynamic that we are seeing. The U.S., since expressing this support, which took a lot of people aback, because the U.S. has been quite opposed to these kinds of loosening of intellectual property rights standards. But since that support was expressed, the Biden administration has not really backed up that support. So, for instance, one thing that the U.S. could do that would immediately have an impact is to come up with a draft. If there's a draft text of the waiver, then there are things that we can negotiate about, even disagree, and produce leverage so that we can talk about these issues. But the fact that a reasonable text has not yet emerged, I think, is quite telling of how much that support actually means on the ground. The EU, of course, has been very staunchly against the waiver, and it has put in its own counter proposals that many advocates say is leaking time, because now we have to spend time discussing the EU proposal, which is nothing but a rehashed version of the compulsory license arrangement, which we, in a number of developing countries, we know doesn't really work very well. So the EU says, let's use existing rules, existing compulsory licensing rules to ramp up production. But we know in the proposal that it's very selective, because it doesn't really address the real problems with this compulsory licensing model that advocates have raised. It's also, in my view, a little performative, because the EU's proposal often states the obvious. It says you can use compulsory licenses. We know we can use compulsory licenses, but compulsory licenses only work for patents. Now, the waiver is much broader. It's talking about patents and all kinds of intellectual property rights, including copyright and trade secrets across the board, not just for vaccines and not just patents. So this is very reductive. Plus, we must remember that many patents may not be filed in the territories that we're talking about. So many low and middle income countries may not even see a patent filed in these jurisdictions. And if a patent is not filed, you can't compulsorily license a patent. And therefore, it's a little obfuscatory, I think, for the EU to come up with that sort of proposal. So yes, I think it does remain quite bleak when we see how wealthy countries, the UK included, has resisted the TRIPS waiver.
To put it simply, when we look at this resistance, of course, it by and large suggests that these high-income countries don't actually care as much for the developing world as they claim to.
Kathy, I have to admit, it's a catastrophic moral failing. It's also epidemiologically very perilous for them to take this attitude that, if we are vaccinated, that's sufficient. Even the WHO's own target was about 10% of the population to be vaccinated by the end of this year, which in my view is far too little. Would populations of wealthy countries accept a 10% target? No, I don't think so. So as the WHO director said, we're in danger of this becoming a two-tier pandemic, that the countries that have populations that are largely vaccinated are assuming that they can move beyond COVID, whereas other parts of the world continue to reel under the pandemic effects. And yes, I have to say it's very disappointing. I think it's a failure of international solidarity. And in spite of so many of us working so hard to make the case, we're seeing such little movement. I think more can be done. We need to put even greater pressure on governments in the West to see some movement. Now, even if the waiver didn't pass through at the WTO in the form that we want, there are other things that need to happen and can happen. So the waiver, I think it's good to regard the waiver as a sort of umbrella term, a sort of a masthead from which a number of actions need to flow. If voluntary licenses are possible, if pharmaceutical companies are willing to engage in the voluntary transfer of technology, great. We may not need the waiver, but that hasn't happened for a year. So I sincerely hope Western governments will learn at least 12 months that have passed, lessons from the 12 months that have passed, and say, look, it hasn't been working. What can we do? We need to scale up production of vaccines on a war footing. So what do we do next?
Siva Tambiseti, let me thank you so much for your time tonight, as always. Associate Professor of Intellectual Property Law at the London School of Economics and Political Science.